So one of like the main selling points I think of Daytona is like the ability to self-host it, and like your whole thing is open source. So like where does the contract come in? What am I paying you for other than to use the piece of technology?
Absolutely. So the whole thing is not open
Okay.
source. So that's very specific. So we did a lot of research on open source. I feel that every week there's a new open source drama. Every week, like there's a new one. Maybe not every week, but there's a drama nonstop. And so when we were thinking about it, we started first as a on-prem enterprise solution proprietary. That's how we started because we weren't sure how to create an open source license and or product that we won't either kill ourselves or kill our users or screw something up long term. And so we thought about it for a very, very long time. I think it was like 9, 10 months that we spent on the back burner trying to figure this out and talking to everyone that we could. And what we understood is that if we want to enable a open source project, you should not open source the core value of that. Or to be more specific, you shouldn't open source the core value to your customer. You should open source the core value to your user if you can. And that is something that took us a while to figure out. And when we thought about it, like, who is our user? Okay, it's the developer. They don't care about scalability. They don't care about authorization. They don't care about audit logs. They don't care about, SOC 2 compliance. They don't care about any of these things. They just care that there's like one command and it spins up automatically running. We're like, okay, that was it took us a while to figure that out. And then we decided to sort of carve out that part of the enterprise of Daytona and create it as its standalone product and open source that. And then when we were thinking about it, and the reason we wanted to do that, it's actually twofold. If you open source the entire enterprise product, one, it's useless to the individual developer. So the people that can actually might want to use it, contribute to it, it's useless for them. The only person it's useful for is someone in the enterprise, and that's the person you want to sell it to. So that's why we decided to make a distinction between what is proprietary code and what is open source code. And then we were thinking about, open core, like GitLab or whatever it may be. And our thought behind that is like, how many contributors will we actually get if it's this huge repository with multiple folders that have multiple different like licenses? Then it's like, oh, what can I do? What can I work on? What can I not? And so we decided to split it up into two repositories, which is harder for us long-term to manage it, but we feel it's easier for the user and or contributor because it's a really small repository. It's a really small project. It's in one language mostly. You can just like check it out, fork it, work on it, and it gets the job done. And so that is how we decided what we decided to open source. And the last part was essentially like the license itself. It didn't go in that order. But when we were thinking about license, now that we've pulled out what is the value for the user, but not the buyer, it didn't really matter what the license was. So we can make it as liberal as possible. And so basically we put it as Apache 2.0. We decided that versus MIT just so the name Daytona stays in there. Like we made it so you have to reference it, but that's the only real restriction that's in there versus going into other more complex licenses. And as I've talked to a bunch of open source founders as well, I did not know or was not aware of the degree of hate for all other licenses. Not that everyone hates all licenses, but there's tribes of people that hate other licenses. And like, if you're like MIT and Apache, you're all good. Like no one hates you, right? So when we were thinking about that and sort of back to your original question is we open source what is valuable for the user, and hopefully the Daytona open source becomes a way of work for every single individual or developer in the world. That is the plan. And people can, build on top of that, fork it, they can do whatever they want, contribute to it. That's great. But everything that the actual buyer wants is proprietary, and that's not open source. So essentially, yes, you're buying it to self-manage, but you're also buying it because you actually can't get it without a license.
I think that makes a lot of sense. This sort of like open source business model contention we see in a lot of places, like database companies especially, I think are having this like long moment of just trying to figure out like, is, building a database company possible on like a standard open source license? And, in general, it's seeming like the answer is that to no, because I think one of the insights here is like what you were saying, it's like, are you opening sourcing it for the user? Are you opening it sourcing it for the like company and, or for the enterprise? And I think that, if your product is hard to separate one from the other, then, it becomes like a bit of a challenge and you have to think more critically about licensing.
I was just going to say that I agree with that. We know a bunch of open source companies are doing great. So Supabase, the CEO is an angel in Daytona as well. Love them, doing really great. But you have a lot of these, to your point, database companies where it's open source and the only value that they're giving him is a SaaS platform on top of that. Now, maybe some of them are building extra things in the SaaS, which is essentially proprietary, which makes sense. But other than that, that is a very, very tricky business long term, right? Because anyone, we know what happened to Elastic, but anyone else can actually host it and do it themselves. Another specific one is where people will just put the whole thing on AGPL, which is like, oh, like Amazon can't do this, sure, but your buyer can, and then they're not buying it from you, which is also an issue. So I feel that there's a lot of problems with that. And it seems to be getting worse because people are now, especially with the last issue about a month ago, where people are now trying to even move away from open source because founders nor investors seem to understand the nuances of it. No one has taken the time to read these licenses. And now it's either the understanding is everything is free or we're not allowed to do anything, and which is neither of them is true. And then people are starting to push away, which I think will be very bad or detrimental for the industry in general, especially for DevTools.
Yeah, I feel like AI has almost pushed this issue a little more because, like, right now we have like Hugging Face, which is like AI GitHub, and it feels like when you're looking at it, like, oh, these are all things that I could use. They're open source. I know the weights, but then you get into the licenses, and it's like none of these could I build a company on, and it like I can understand the knee jerk reaction of, oh, anything but those two licenses is like it's kind of too hard or impossible to use.
Yeah, it's very complex for the user. And I remember when we were talking to one of, like, we consulted with a bunch of lawyers as well to figure this out. And they're like, enterprises will not use it unless it's one of the few licenses that they understand because it's just like complicated. They don't have time to use it. And then the question is it even valuable to be open source then? Like, what are you trying to achieve putting it out there if it's going to be too complicated for people to use that, right? So I mean, that's my thought as well. Like there is source available, which is not open source, but it's just the code is out there. And I think that's fine if there's a use case for that. So we might put our proprietary code source available, which is the reason is an enterprise can download it and run the thing by themselves to try it out essentially as a demo. But that's the only value I see in that. Anything else, to your point, I feel it's like super complex and you might as well just not do it because it's too much effort for very little value to anyone else.